In 2021, Years 3 and 4 at Greentop School began this summer a learning exploration with the guiding question of why is it so important to share our different stories about World War II. Our learning targets were Case Study 1, History. I can describe accounts of a historical event. I can suggest causes and consequences of some of the main events in history. I can use dates and terms to describe events.
Case Study 2, History. I can describe the characteristic features of the past, including ideas, beliefs, attitudes, and experiences of women and children.
Case Study 3, Art. I can sketch lightly, no need to use a rubber to correct mistakes. I can use hatching and cross-hatching to show tone and texture. I can experiment with the thickness of lines to represent different tones printing. I can create multiple drafts to develop my printing crafts through critique.
The expedition began with Immersion Week. We created anchor charts that helped us understand the causes of the war, such as the Great Depression. After that, we studied the timeline of key events from World War II. This activity gave us many questions about the war that we could study in more detail during our first 2 case studies.
By the end of the immersion week, we had a good knowledge of why the war started and what had happened during the war. On top of this, we had emerged our classrooms and corridors to hook us into our learning further. Our corridors depicted the various stages of the war, beginning with an evacuation scene and finishing with the VE Day celebration.
Immersion Week provided our phase with learning equity so that we could all begin our first case study with some background knowledge that we can build on.
In Case Study 1, we became inquisitive historians. We developed our knowledge of World War II by using primary and secondary sources of information. We studied evacuations, the Blitz, and why rationing was so important.
This learning supported us in understanding what life was like during this time. We made lots of connections to our anchor charts that we created during this immersion week.
In Case Study 2, we continued to study history. We looked at roles of women during World War and how this began to challenge people's ideas about gender, about how women and men should behave and look, what qualities they should inhabit, and what roles they should have assumed in their families and communities.
We held powerful discussions around these topics. Additionally, we learned about the tremendous war effects of other cultures, making many links to our G-Block studies of Jewish faith. Finally, in Case Study 3, we became artists and developed our portrait drawing skills. We used light sketching skills and the boxing up method.
Once we have drafted and critiqued our work and knew it was our best work, we moved on to the print techniques to create portraits of the war veterans we interviewed in our English lessons.
Our key literature was An Elephant in the Garden by Michael Morpurgo, a beautiful tale about a young boy who visits a nursing home and listens to a resident story of her childhood in Germany during the war.
Alongside this, other texts such as The Lion and the Unicorn by Shirley Hughes to support our learning around evacuation. Our final product culminated in our beautiful presented book that celebrates the stories of people who experienced war in our local community. The book tells the fascinating stories of our expert through the children's writing craft.
Here's an example of our work. Alongside of our stories, we also produced free verse poetry as part of one of our English cycles. Year 3 focused on emotive poetry based on evacuations, and Year 4 crafted their poetry on the Blitz. Our focus was to include emotive and figurative language.
Harry was born in Doncaster in 1930. He was 9 years old when World War II broke out in 1939. He lived in Balby with his aunt and uncle during the war. This is Harry's story. He recalls that one night a horrific, terrible landmine caused a massive amount of damage in his area.
It flew on a parachute. As a child, Harry remembered missing lots of school. If the air raid siren sounded after a certain time, school would be shut the following day. Unexpectedly, Harry joined the Army Cadets at the age of 10. At this time, the cadets were not worried about people's ages as they desperately needed volunteers. Every Sunday, the cadets would practice maneuvers in the local woods. At his young age, Harry's biggest worry was other families that lived around him because there were an enormous amount of casualties in the war. Harry remembers looking out for the man that delivered the telegrams. If he delivered one to a house, it usually meant that someone in their family had either been killed in the war or taken as prisoner. He would feel terrible for the families that received one. Harry was thankful that his family never received such a telegram. It is so important that we share Harry's story because it is very interesting to hear about the things that people went through in the dark, worrying times of World War II. As well as this, we should never forget what happened in the war.